So, I've been thinking a lot lately about grief and the intersection between what we call mom guilt and grief. Today, we're going to talk about that. I wonder, are we actually feeling guilty about our job as mom, or are we grieving something that feels like loss? As always, we're going to start with a story. A few weekends ago, I gathered in New York City with my girlfriends from high school for a 50th birthday celebration. As we do, we ended up talking about all the things in our lives. And when I mentioned my latest research obsession, this intersection between mom guilt and mom grief, an interesting thing happened. We've been friends since we were 14. A few of us have even been friends since way before that. But as a group, we came together a freshman year in high school, and we've been with each other through all of the life stages since then. We've been together as kids, and we've been together raising kids. And so we've seen all of those transitions and all of our own growth through adulthood and through motherhood with a closer eye than maybe many have. Even when I moved away, they all still live in the same place, but we managed to sort of get together enough that we were able to know each other's kids, know ourselves as moms, and be there for each other through the whole thing. We all have wildly different mom approaches, and our kids are all vastly different. Some have similarities, but for the most part, besides their ages, they're not anything alike. So when I brought up my theory of mom guilt, I have one friend who had a response that was kind of interesting and had me considering this whole thing in a very different way. This friend of mine, I've known her since our babies were born. Well, really, since long before that, since we were babies. But we were fairly close even when our first babies were born. We were teachers together. We had kids almost exactly the same age. We lived close. And I never knew her to feel guilty. I'm sure she did. She'd probably, if she came on here, would tell you a very different story. But from the outside, it looked like every decision she made, she felt really strongly and really confident about, whether it was against the grain or just like everybody else. She seemed to know who she was as a mom, know what she wanted for those kids, and feel good about the decisions she was making. In those early days, I really aspired to be more like her, because it felt like from the moment we both were choosing how to feed the babies or whether to go back to work, she would announce whatever it was proudly, and I felt like everything I was doing was wrong and cried every time I had to make a choice because it felt like it wasn't the right choice. When we both went back to work at our teaching jobs, she went back happily, stating she was a better mom if she had a professional fulfillment and things that made her whole. All facts, all things we know to be true. But in those early days and in that moment for me, I had the exact opposite experience. She never worried for a second that her kids were missing out on anything. And I cried every single morning when I dropped my daughter off at daycare to go to the exact same job she was going to. A job I used to love and take great pride in pre-babies. I was 100% certain I was going to go back to it. And the minute I had to, all I did was feel like the worst mom in the whole world. I never thought my friend had any reason to feel guilty about nursing or not nursing or going back to work or staying home or whatever decision she made. It never occurred to me that she wasn't making the right one. But I was nearly taken over by guilt every time I filled a bottle or dropped my baby at daycare. And I didn't understand why. As our kids grew up, this woman was the definition of supermom. She worked a full-time job. She earned multiple advanced degrees. She ran ultra marathons. And I don't think she missed a single sporting event or school milestone or family ski vacation. And not only did she attend those things, she attended those things with the gusto and enthusiasm of what can only be described as a superfan. She was so fully present with her kids that I'm sure they never for one second could have possibly thought she wasn't fully in love with them and everything that they were, even as she balanced all of that out with her own personal ambitions, professional and otherwise. I mean, come on, I'm realistic. I'm sure there were moments where everybody thought they were doing it wrong and her kids, thought she was the worst and all of those things that are realistic. I'm not painting her as some perfect and everything else. But I am telling you, the way that we think we're supposed to do it, it sure looked like she was doing it that way. And so it kind of came as no surprise to me that during this girls' weekend, she heard me talk about grief and immediately was like, yup, I am in that right now. Both of the kids are out of the house. They're both growing into amazing young adults. And while she still has a very full professional and personal life, she was real open and honest about the fact that when the last one left, she was going to need some space to grieve. She was going to feel the loss in such a profound way that she made space for herself to be able to grieve the process. And sure enough, when the grief came over her as her babies grew up, she was open to it. She warned others it was coming, and she gave herself the grace to get through it. Those first few months of empty nesting, she was open to whatever she needed in that time, including some last minute trips to college to see those kiddos. As we swapped our stories in that New York City hotel room, I realized that maybe in those early days, she didn't feel guilty because she was more open to what was really going on. Those feelings for me probably weren't guilt. They were actually grief. And she wasn't experiencing that same thing in the same way because she was making decisions she felt good about. And it turns out I was making decisions based on what I thought was supposed to be instead of what actually was, or what I thought I was supposed to feel instead of what I actually was. Remember, I told you in those early days, I thought I was definitely going back to work. I was going to be a, education professional, and I was going to work for 35 years and rise in the ranks and all of those things. And then I had a baby and everything changed. I didn't want to be that same person. I didn't want to leave her. So while my friend was able to forge ahead, it's because her expectations had been met. She knew what she wanted, and it didn't change when she had the babies. And that also meant she could be a really great mom. For me, everything flipped on its head when I had a baby, and I wasn't even sure what I was or who I was or what I wanted or how I was supposed to move forward. And so everything felt wrong. So while she was doing the exact same thing I was doing, she felt great about it. And I was in tears more often than not. Those decisions were based on preconceived notions or on what I thought I was supposed to do. Whereas her decisions came from what she wanted and knew was the right thing for her. So it turns out my guilt was actually grief. That gut feeling that rose up was really about the losses that were coming with the choices I was making rather than the choices themselves. When you look up mom guilt on the internet, the Cleveland Health Clinic has a definition that says, mom guilt is a name given to the feelings of guilt and shame some people feel when they don't live up to their own or others' expectations in their role as parent. It's like an internal dialogue that tells you you're failing as a caregiver. Harsh, right? Yeesh. So it may be harsh, but it may also be that the explanation is right there in the definition. Not living up to our own expectations or others' expectations of what we're supposed to be. That's where the loss comes in. Another thing the Cleveland Clinic does on the internet is when they are discussing grief, they use the word guilt in some of the definitions. I found that pretty interesting. So let's talk about grief. There are a bunch of types of grief. And if you look that up, you can get anywhere from 3 to 15 different types of grief, depending on who you talk about. We think of grief mostly as having to do with death. And even with death, we're not so good at grief. There are other types, though, and that's where this comes in. The motherhood piece and the grief piece. So we're going to talk about a few of the myriad that are out there. And mostly we're going to talk about the common thread that goes through them all. So anticipatory grief is when you know a loss is coming and you start the process before that loss. My friend knew that when her nest was going to be empty, she was going to be grieving. She may have even started that process before the kids were fully out of the house because she knew it was coming. That loss was felt in the spirit of the house all the way up to it. Anticipatory grief is probably why I cried the day my last child got their driver's license. I knew gone were the days of really great car talks. I knew I wasn't going to see them every single Friday when I went to pick them up from school because they didn't need that anymore. And the months leading up to that license were so hard. And I know enough now to know that's grief, not guilt. I wasn't guilty that we didn't get the lessons on time. I wasn't guilty that I might not be able to be there with them. I wasn't guilty about any of that stuff. I was sad. I was grieving the loss of that time in our life. That's anticipatory grief. Disenfranchised grief is when the grieving isn't recognized or something about the process or the relationship that you're grieving isn't recognized. Meaning, maybe you had a bad relationship with a sibling and that sibling dies and somebody is upset that you are feeling bad about that loss. In motherhood terms, it might be, this is a wonderful thing coming. This is a wonderful thing, this kid growing up and moving on and having all of their wonderful dreams. And I feel terrible about it. And that grief is a bit disenfranchised because we're not allowed to feel sad about our kids' accomplishments and growth. And that can provide some time for grief, which might look and feel a whole lot like guilt. You might feel guilty about feeling sad that they got their driver's license, and we shouldn't have to. It is a sad moment for us, while it is also a wonderful moment for them. And then I think what really comes into play a lot of times for moms is non-finite grief, which is the grief that comes from the loss of what happens when what we expect doesn't happen. If you've had a really rocky fertility journey, you can have some non-finite grief. If you've had a fertility journey or you've just gotten had a new baby come into your life that you're really excited about and really expecting and really think it's going to be great, and then it doesn't feel great. You have postpartum depression, or you're just tired and wrung out and stressed and all of the things that happen when you have a new baby in your house. Sometimes we can grieve that process because what we expected was this wonderful, bonding, beautiful moment with our child. And really what we are is sleep deprived and covered in puke. And so that can feel an awful lot like guilt. Oh, here's a thing I really wanted, and now I have it and I feel shitty about it. That can feel like something that we should feel guilty about, when in fact, what we might be experiencing is this non-finite grief. This thing that I was fully expecting did not happen the way I expected it to. When I was faced with the decision to go back to work, to a job that I really loved, or stay home with this baby, I fully expected that I was going to want to go back to the job that I really loved. And then that's not how it went. And I felt so guilty every day leaving her at daycare when she was perfectly well taken care of and in love with the other kids in that little home and had the most dear caregiver. I felt like my heart was being ripped out of my chest every single time. But that wasn't guilt. I wasn't doing anything wrong. I was actually grieving that time with her because I wanted to be there. Even if I had fully expected that to happen, I might still have felt sad about it, even if you have no choice. And at that point, I didn't. I had to go back to work. That can really be grief that you're feeling. You shouldn't feel guilty about having to go back to work, but you might feel bad about it. And that really is the grief of, I wish I could be doing this instead. The common thread through all of this is that loss is the impetus for grief. When my friend and I were making similar decisions and feeling opposite ways about them, she didn't feel the same sense of loss that I did. I was experiencing such a shift in what I expected and what the reality was that everything felt like a loss. Every decision I made was racked with grief that I understood to be guilt because I was the mom making these decisions, and that felt terrible inside. Maybe you can relate. Whenever we feel that pit in our stomach because we think we're doing something wrong, maybe we need to examine the why behind what we're doing and the why behind why we think it isn't right. So what do? I always like to give you some tangible to take away so that I'm not just talking about how terrible everything is and then leaving you with that. So as always, pretty much with me, the first step is that awareness piece, tuning in, noticing when those feelings come, what's going on? Am I feeling this way because it's a transitional moment and maybe I'm losing something here, either a piece of my identity or a part of this job of mom that I'm not going to do anymore? Or maybe the relationship is shifting and I'm missing the parts that used to be. Somebody once said, or I heard somebody say, you never know it's going to be the last time you hold that little hand. You sort of never have that awareness of the last time you're going to hold that hand. I'm not sure it would matter if you did know. You're still going to miss it. And that's sad. And the guilt may come in with, oh, I shouldn't be sad. My kid is healthy and happy and growing and lovely. But it's okay to grieve the transitional losses that happen as your kids grow and your job as mom changes. Tuning in can also tell us, are you missing the time you wish you were having with them or that you had with them that is no longer? Is it time you think you should have? Again, when I went back to work, all I was really doing was missing being with her 24/7. As it turns out, years later, when I did stop working for a little while to stay home with babies, I did not like being home 24/7 with them either. So that's a whole other can of worms that we could do another episode on. But those expectations shifted for me. And so I was really missing the time. So are you missing time with them? Are you missing their little selves when you drop them off at their first sleepover? Are you missing, their little selves when you drop them off at grandma's so you can go on a 2-day vacation? Maybe you're wishing, oh, I wish I could always want to be with them. And I'm grieving the loss of those wishes because nobody's really like that. But if your expectations were that you were going to be with them and happy to be with them 24/7, 365, and now you're not because you're human and nobody feels that way, you might be grieving the loss of that expectation. Those moms who feel guilty of relieving your kids, is it because you think they're suffering? Or are you sad that you don't want to be with them 100% of the time because the world tells you you're supposed to feel that way? Do you feel guilty over not making homemade cupcakes? Or is it really that you're grieving the loss of that role because someone told you you were supposed to be that way? You were supposed to have the fancy birthday treats because that's what good moms, quote unquote, do. How about when you realize that your kids are fine without you? What is that loss instead of the guilt over I left them? Make room for grief as they grow. This is a tip from a mom of older kids. Own your role in that growth, own your role in the losses that you experience, and make room for it because there's loss as they grow. Notice when those feelings come. Is it after a blow up with them? Is it after you said something you wish you didn't say? Because there's guilt there that's trying to tell you something. You might be wishing that it went differently. You might be wishing your relationship was different. You might be feeling bad because you want the relationship to look different. But what does that actually mean to you? Because if in your head, the relationship is supposed to be perfect and you're never supposed to be angry and you're never supposed to shout, well, then you're actually grieving an unmet expectation that is probably impossible anyway. So can you take a step back and just look at the actual relationship between you guys and realize, oh, I can repair this thing that I'm feeling bad about, and then I don't have to feel guilty anymore because I repaired it. And that's the important part anyway. The relationship is still intact because you might be wishing you did it differently, or you might be punishing yourself for doing it wrong ever. And those are two very different things. So tuning in to what it is you're actually feeling instead of what you think you're feeling based on what the world tells you is supposed to be. If you feel guilty when your kids are upset that you can't give them what they want right when they want it, is it because you think you're supposed to? Or are you just upset that your kids are upset and that feels bad? Because tuning in that moment might help you realize that you have zero things to feel guilty about and you're doing the best job you can, which is just enough for them. If you're having guilt after a divorce or a move or some big life event that you know wasn't the greatest for them and also was completely necessary and impossible for you to change, chances are pretty high that what you're feeling shouldn't be linked to a lack of being on your part. Meaning, if there's guilt around a life event that's hard, what's the point of the guilt? Are you sad for your kids? Great. Are you sad for yourself that you had to make this choice? Sure. Make room for that sadness and grief instead of punishing yourself with the guilt over something that doesn't deserve it. Instead of feeling the loss or the sense that something's missing, perhaps it's an expectation or the support that you might have needed to make a different decision. Feeling like motherhood is hard shouldn't be guilt-inducing because it is hard. So it's okay to sometimes feel that way about it. I'm not here to say you're never going to feel guilty. I'm not here to say you should never feel guilty. Sometimes guilt says things to us that we need to hear. But I am saying that you probably shouldn't feel guilty as often as you do. I'm also not saying that by recognizing that guilt as grief, it's going to feel a whole lot better. Because let's be honest, grief stinks. It doesn't feel good, especially if the world doesn't validate it or allow us room for it. And kids growing up feel sad sometimes. It's just part of it. What I am saying, though, is that grief is an indicator of how much love we feel. And so we should expect it as our role as mom changes, as our kids change, as things look different and feel different moving forward. We have so much love for these people that it just makes sense that when we lose certain things, we're going to feel grief over it. I'm also saying this. Moms deserve more grace, less guilt, especially from themselves. So next time you have that feeling that you think is guilt, tune in. See what's really going on. Examine what your expectations were for the situation and see if there is a loss that you need to acknowledge and grieve if it's necessary. When you feel that familiar pang or that gut punch, check in to see if it's grief about what isn't. Then give yourself the grace to get through it without judgment or letting that internal voice that says you're failing as a caregiver come in. Instead, give yourself a pat on the back for being a supermom, just like my friend.